Okay, not bad. It's okay, fine. You can be in the presentation. It doesn't matter. Now, how do I? When I go to, it's on the desktop, right?
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for APIED Expert Lecture Series Excellence 2021. So before we proceed, I would like to request all the participants to please keep their mic muted during the presentation and type their questions into the chat box to be discussed later in the session. On the occasion of International Women's Day, I, Pratyusha Patel, on behalf of APID family, would like to invite one of the inspiring and leading architects in our today's guest lecture, architect Swanzal Kak Kapoor, to present on design as an experience of space and place. Architect Swanzal Kak Kapoor is the design principal at Saka Studio, an award-winning architectural practice based in Gurgaon. She has more than 20 years of experience of working in a diversity of contexts and scales and believes in architecture of resonance and a culture of social responsibility. She has a bachelor's degree in architecture from the Institute of Environmental Design at Vallabh, Vidyanagar, Gujarat. She has a deep interest in ecology, sustainability, civic action, architectural history, and arts. Her architectural and interior work celebrates cultural specificity, craft, embodied emotions, ecological consciousness, and collaborative synergy. She has spoken at a variety of forums across the country and been a juror at SPA Bhopal and SSAA Gurgaon. Her interest in civic action and the environment led to her co-founding iamgurgaon in 2009, a platform to enable change through community participation, and she has been an integral member of the team behind the 385-acre Aravali Biodiversity Park in Gurgaon. She also volunteers her time as a member of IIID Delhi Regional Chapter Managing Committee. Her awards include the IIID National Award 2016 for Residential Design and the World Architecture Community Award 27th cycle in March 2018 for Tree House. So now we will turn the time over to architect Swanzal Kak Kapoor. Ma'am, please. Ma'am, your mic is muted. You need to turn on your mic.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and it's a very special honor to be presenting to all of you today because, as you know, I studied at IED as well, and it's a place that I think has great memories for me, and I think a lot of what I've learned I owe to IED. So I'm glad to share my journey with you today through this presentation, which is titled "Design as an Experience of Space and Place." Um, Can you see the screen? Have you? Can you? Is the screen visible?
Yes, ma'am, your screen is visible.
Okay. Okay. All right. So the presentation is actually going to be across 6 sections, which are titled Explorations, Provocations, Inspirations, Preparation, Practice, and Possible Futures. The first section, which is explorations, is really looking at, what is space and place? What is the difference between space and place? I'd like to look at it as the idea of a space being something which has potential. It's empty, and it becomes a place only when it is filled with certain uh, values and like feeling, empathy, memory, meaning, aspirations, and identity. And it's only when you actually have an alignment of many elements coming together. And we actually, as architects and interior designers, employ many devices in terms of form, in terms of color, in terms of light, in terms of relationships between spaces to create something which is what we would like to call like a charged field, which we term an architecture of resonance. So if you look at this idea of what is design, so design is actually many things, but primarily I think for me it is really making the ordinary extraordinary, and to create an experience that actually transforms in some way the existing reality. And that is really the role of great architecture and great design, to create a new narrative that forms a continuity with existing narratives, but takes the person who's experiencing the space beyond what has been experienced before. What do we look at as experience? So, when we are kind of designing an experience, when we are actually designing a space that is going to have some meaning for the person who's experiencing it, we are actually using a language, and we are using a language which is made up of materials, which is made up of uh, how we bring solids and voids together, what colors are employed. But at the same time, how people respond to it is very deeply personal to them, to their own life state and their own experiences so far. So, the most interesting thing about experience is that it is unique for each person, uh, and no two people have the same experience, even when they are inhabiting the same space. And this is where this idea of non-verbal communication actually enters the picture. Because when you look at actually the idea of placemaking and the idea of what is personal, it is each of us have our own life experience that we bring and carry with us, and the memories that we have. So it is our memories which shape our reaction to what we're experiencing in the present. And that actually, that memory and that conditioning actually profoundly shapes our relationship with spaces, with things, and with people. In fact, there's a researcher called Sarah Williams Goldhagen who talks about how actually the neural networks that are formed, which are related to identity, are also the same neural networks that are related to identifying and orienting physical environments. So, actually, the memories that create our own sense of identity are actually linked to the spaces that we experience them in. So, you can't actually separate identity and the space that you experienced that uh, and what forms that identity. So, so here again, this idea of how the spaces and that we see in our minds and the physical manifestations of how we experience them says more really about who we are than it actually does about the space. Uh, then the idea that how experience is something that can actually never really be fully communicated. We can only really understand the stories or the narratives that we are engaging with through the lens of our own experience. And this is where what I was explaining earlier, which is that narrative is also held bodily as memory. So, the environments, the link between environments and autobiographical memory. So, our memories that define ourself and the places in which those memories are made can't actually be separated. So, what exactly is this architecture of resonance that I would like to speak to you about today? It's basically, as a word, what it means is just two meanings. It is the quality in a sound of being deep, full, and reverberating. It's also the power to evoke enduring images, memories, and emotions. So, actually, what we believe how this resonance is actually created is when the space actually has certain values embedded in it. So the values that as a practice, we believe is something that adds a great deal of specificity, or what we would call a genus loci, or a unique spirit of place, is sensory richness, timelessness, repose, beauty, and dynamic value, and the principles of ecological consciousness and cultural specificity. And when we do this, we actually create spaces which have an expansive spirit and a unique quality that actually has the ability to uplift our human experience and heighten our awareness of our own potential. So, spaces that actually do this actually, in many ways, achieve their fullest potential because they allow us to become aware of our own highest potential. Uh, Moving on, so, as a definition, genus loci is a Roman concept that means that every place has its unique genius or spirit. And as Heidegger says, a thing gathers world. So, we can't actually separate spaces and places from the objects that are placed within them. So, as architects and interior designers, we have to be uniquely conscious of what is this assembly of material and object and color and light that comes together to create a unique place. And we also have to understand that there is a larger significance to whatever we choose to include and whatever we choose to exclude. So, I'd like to kind of present to you some provocations, which is basically the idea is that, very often as architects and interior designers, we are told to think about aesthetic value. That is somehow the primary discourse is about uh, how beautiful is it to look at. But architecture and interiors and great design is actually much more than that. And we have to be deeply aware of the larger significance of the choices that we make, because there are larger significances. And especially in the context that we're looking at in terms of uh, our current COVID reality, I think the direction that we all need to very carefully move into is a space of really looking at the essence and, what is the essential that is required. So here's the idea of, the same stories say different things to different people. This is from The Invisible City by Italo Calvino, where he says, I speak and speak, Marco says, but the listener retains only the words he's expecting. It is not the voice that commands the story, it is the ear. So, does the story, once it's told, belong to the storyteller or does it belong to the listener? Coming to what I was discussing a few seconds earlier about our current reality, and this is a consciousness that we have to very carefully cultivate because it is going to become increasingly relevant in the years to come, is that a deep awareness that whenever we design anything or whenever we include anything in the spaces that we create, we are parallelly consuming resources from the earth. And we have to deeply think about whether uh, what are the implications of this. So when we have conversations about local versus global, uh, there are always choices available, and this is something that we are somehow never really it's never really spoken about when we are learning about architecture and design, because there's so much enthusiasm about creating something new, but there are many possibilities, and increasingly one is moving towards a space where one feels that a restoration space or a space where you kind of re-energize a space through very little addition but a lot of realignment can actually achieve as much, if not more, than completely kind of creating something from scratch and adding new things. So I think we will always need to be conscious of the fact, and especially when we look at interior design, uh, and you look at homes, spaces have narratives. There are existing memories, there are existing experiences that have led each family to kind of collect and curate the objects that have a meaning to them. many times spanning many generations, belonging to parents, grandparents. And I think as architects and interior designers, we have to be sensitive to that. So it really has to be a collaborative space where one understands the meaning and things that have value to the family that one is creating for, or the context one is creating for, and try and create something which actually allows the past to continue in a new form. Uh, this, I think, comes into kind of particular, I would say, center stage in today's context, where, we live in a world where there is a great degree of global aspiration in communities and corporations, in many of who we would call our clients, right? And at the same time, we have to understand that we live in a very specific context. India is a unique entity. And the spaces that we create and the materials we use to create those spaces, there are kind of subconscious associations of materials and objects with a larger meaning. So we really have to seek an expression that actually meets global aspirations while also simultaneously being very deeply rooted in our own culture. Because there is a danger in adopting an aesthetic quality and a visual language which doesn't really belong to our specific context, because at some point you're then kind of creating a kind of, almost, I would say, um, like a schism between the past and the future. So our role is really to negotiate that present in a very, very careful way that manages to do that. And then again, it comes back to the idea of the individual versus the collective. Uh, Many times there are families who have needs and who want to create a certain kind of form of home or an expression of home, but it may not be the healthiest choice in terms of, for that particular context, for the kind of economical costs and the therefore ecological costs that are implied in those choices. So, as architects, we also, I believe, have a responsibility to kind of negotiate that space with clients and help them to understand the larger implications of their decisions, so that it is not only limited to the needs of the family, but you also look at the larger responsibility towards the collective. And then the idea of really kind of cultivating a way of seeing, like how do you actually train your eye to be so um, so sensitive to what is being created that you can pick up one thing that doesn't fit the narrative, or figure out the one thing that is required to complete that space or interior and bring it to balance. And then the idea of uh, communicating experience. If we are looking at wanting people to experience certain quality within a space, how do you communicate that experience? So that is another skill that has to be developed as an architect, as an interior designer, to understand that what are we selecting? What are we actually choosing to include, so that we can take this abstract emotion that we want people to feel and create an expression that amplifies that. And this is a slightly more philosophical, but at the same time, I think very currently critical idea, which is that embracing impermanence. Increasingly, I think that what we need to realize is that given the kind of very rapidly changing needs of societies, families, uh, uh, office spaces, many contexts, how do you actually create uh, architecture and interiors that are more nimble, that allow change, that allow multiplicity of functions? So this is something, and something that is, I would say, frugal and nimble enough that can actually absorb change and remain relevant, even in very changing circumstances. And then the idea that architecture is a political act. So a lot of the time, I think that in our country, we see that, there are great polarities. There are the invisibles, which is the migrant labor, many times children and women in cityscapes, and uh, people who are differently abled, our cities do not provide for them. Our public spaces do not provide for them in many cases. It's only now that there's become an awareness that we truly have to create an architecture that is inclusive, includes everybody, and also an understanding of what is being said, what is being spoken. If you look at the way that institutions have been designed in our country, they've been designed pretty much the same way for years. So the idea of, does architecture need to undergo an essential shift, which relates to the fact that times have changed, that people need to be included in processes, that institutions no longer need to be dominant figures in landscapes, but perhaps they can be more of a lattice like space, which allows people to connect, it allows many functions. So these are all thoughts that we need to kind of be thinking about. And then, whose narrative is it? I mean, one of the things that, personally as a practitioner, I feel very passionate about is that I do believe that collaborative design creates the most, I think, many cases, rich and deep solutions, because you're getting a multiplicity of minds to actually apply themselves to the question to find a solution. So, but at the same time, as a practitioner, you need to be open to that. You need to be open to truly listening to your clients' needs, truly listening to what inputs you're getting from all the other people who participate in the process, whether it's, the mystery on the site, whether it's vendors, whether it's the skilled labor we were interacting with, or the carpenters you work with. Each of these sets of people have their unique perspectives and their unique life experiences, which can actually really transform what is created, provided the architect, who in many cases becomes that sutradhar, the person who's kind of holding the whole narrative together, uh, that sensitivity is required to be able to do that. And I wanted to share a few inspirations and just talk about them based on uh, examples of this unique spirit of place. Um, so the first example I want to share is actually, as many of you must be familiar with this, it is Fatehpur Sikri, which is in Agra. And what not many people actually know about how this was actually constructed is that it's one of the first examples of actually modular architecture construction, because the whole technique of building Fatehpur Sikri was that they actually had divided the entire uh, the architectural facades into modules. So there were columns, there were infill panels, and they had teams of crafts people who were doing their own thing. So they had master craftsmen who were carving columns and jalis. So it was done in an extremely, I would say, for that time, open-ended way, like in direct contrast, for example, to the Taj Mahal, which actually is very precisely planned. So here you have a certain lightness and a certain quality of dynamism. I think that space really holds, because the whole process of creation was so much freer than what you saw in a lot of the Mughal architecture of the time. So in that sense, it is one of the few precincts that I feel has a great modernity in it. And you can feel that when you actually visit the space. Uh, and then an example that I want to give you also is of the Modera Sun Temple. And a lot is kind of, we talk about stepwells and we talk about sun temples and we talk about sacred spaces. But essentially, I think both stepwells and this particular sun temple look at the sacredness of water and the sacredness of light and the junction at which light meets water. And if you look at the way that the stepped profiling of the edges of the waterline has been done with such great beauty and also great sensitivity, because it also allows the water to rise without really impacting the quality of the experience. So even when the water's levels are higher, the beauty of the composition remains unchanged. So you look at how powerful this is in terms of sensitivity. Um, the next example I want to give you is of actually a contemporary project by a Sri Lankan architect. I'm sure you're all familiar with Jeffrey Bava, and this is a hotel in Kandalama. And I remember visiting this space many years ago, and I remember being completely. It was what was radical about this property was that uh, it's actually built into the side of a hillside, and it is built in such an ingenious way that the whole facade of the hotel, and this is a resort property, is actually entirely creepers. So the external facade of this property almost disappears into the landscape, and the interior, interestingly, is completely finished in black stone. And I remember at that point thinking that this is such an unusual choice, because black was such an unusual choice for an interior at that time. But it actually has such a high degree of reflection that all the exterior views are sharply reflected on floors, which are the highly reflective surfaces, but also on other walls. And I think it was really a profound experience. Also, the idea of ease, and that is something which I think Jeffrey Bava was a master at, of creating spaces where there was a sense of repose and ease and effortlessness. So, a lot of the work that you see today, I mean, even work that is highly commended, the effort is very visible. And I think that's one of the things that we as more conscious architects and interior designers have to pay attention to. That only if you are actually quiet enough and still enough can you come to a point when you realize that you don't really need very much to create a sense of place. You know, it is not something that has to be crowded with things or has to be crowded with different materials. It can be quiet, and in fact, in the context of today, quiet is even more powerful because there's so much noise everywhere around. And this is an absolutely brilliant museum space in Japan called the Teshima Art Museum. And this is really, I think, I would probably categorize this as probably the one of the most profound architectural experiences in my lifetime, because as you can see in the image, it's actually a white concrete shell structure, and it has two skylights that you can see in this picture. And the floor of the shell is also undulating, just like the roof is, and it is built actually on a water spring. And the whole design was, I mean, the vision for this project was to allow the visitor to get to feel a profound connection with the natural world. And so, what it does is that, you know, when you enter the space, actually, all that you're doing is you're walking and you have to remove your shoes and you walk barefoot through the space. And based on the pressure in the ground, because of that spring below, you have water droplets that emerge randomly from the floor. So you have to walk through the space trying to avoid walking on those water droplets. So it's really actually quietly watching water kind of emerge from the ground, become a drop, become a teardrop, become a stream, and then gather in a small little pool. And there are two pools, one under each skylight. And it's completely silent because you're not allowed to speak inside the space. And you have about 15, 20 people who are all walking around in complete silence and just watching these droplets of water. So it's such a unique experience that I think that it's one of those things that you experience it and you think you carry it with you forever. And I think that to me is really what great architecture is about, you know, where you're transformed in some way and then you carry that memory with you forever. And that's what we should really aspire for. More importantly, I think the idea of how little has been employed in the creation of the space, and how this space actually partners with nature to create the experience. So it's the water and it's the light and the soft sound of the trees around that comes through the skylights. And that's all that there is in the experience. And then this is an example of Golconda House in Pondicherry, again, way ahead of its time. And what I would really like to point out here is that the extreme sensitivity to climate responsiveness, because you have the entire facade as a cement louvered facade, which can be actually controlled by the person walking inside. So it allows what I believe is another great quality of placemaking, which is great sensitivity to the local climate, where the wind comes in from, what is the orientation, and allowing people to customize their own thermal comfort level. So you are intelligently responding to the environment constantly. It's not a passive space, it is a dynamic and active and alive space. And I think that is very important. And many times this is forgotten in today's context because people rely so heavily on artificial means of cooling spaces and very often overcompensating. So you have temperatures of 21 degrees and then you're wearing warmer clothes. So there's a basic sensitivity which can be created through the architecture and then further through the interiors in such a way that you are truly sensitive to the environment and the larger environment. And this is Padmanabhapuram Palace, Kerala, which is again an excellent example of local skills. And I don't know how many of you know that, Kerala is known for its carpentry skills. So I had the opportunity to work on two homes in Coorg, which are not very far from Kerala. And actually, there's a long tradition in Coorg that no home is built without a team of carpenters coming in from Kerala to actually build that roof. So, because that's where the skills lie. And this palace is also unique because it has a whole series of interior murals, which are all mineral pigments, and an absolutely spectacular quality of darkness and light and enclosure, which through courtyards and through passages and through enclosed rooms, which create a really unique set of experiences as you move through the space. So now, how do we really? So in this fourth section, I really want to talk about, how do we really prepare for this? I mean, if we're talking about having a way of seeing, having a certain sensitivity towards all these aspects of creating spaces, and at the same time, creating a mindset that is a growth mindset, that is a mindset that is oriented towards transformation and change and learning, because architecture is something that you never ever stop discovering things about, or interiors for that matter. Because as your experiences transform, what you see, what you experience, how an environment reads to you is going to constantly keep transforming. So these are some attitudes and beliefs that which that we've put together, which have worked well for us, which we believe have helped us remain in a space of learning and in a space of looking anew, so that you are always reflecting on how what you're seeing has transformed. So the first attitude, and this is something which is personally extremely important to me, and I believe that is something that we all need to really be conscious of as practicing architects, is universal responsibility. And Mahatma Gandhi ji very famously said that earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. And I think that is incredibly true of the time that we live in. We have actually come into a place where uh, everything has become so accessible. And I think uh, with economies opening up and so much money being available, this idea of consumption has kind of progressed in a way that has been unfettered. And I think that and it's come with its own consequences. So actually, what we're seeing right now in the pandemic and in all the climate change and kind of the disasters that we've been seeing since 2012 are all related to this, the imbalance between how we are consuming. And I think this is something that we need to be very, very aware of. And one of the projects in which I think I have learned probably uh, the most life lessons actually is a project that I've done with an NGO called iamgurgaon, which I also co-founded. And this is a 385-acre restoration project where it's a rewilding project actually, where a denuded mining site has been transformed into a young Aravali forest. And so it's really been an experience in watching how nature really regenerates itself so beautifully if you take the right decisions. And I'd just like to bring a little comment here on the role that landscape plays in creating place. So typically, the way that landscape design is taught and the way trees and plants are again viewed when we are looking at site plans or we're creating homes, and especially in the educational space, is that you're looking at the tree as another object that you're placing. And again, if you look a little more deeply, that object is also only being looked at for its aesthetic value. And this couldn't be further from the more sensitive reality of looking at landscape as ecology. And that I think we're starting to see some sense of now, because so many more people have become ecologically conscious and environmentally conscious. And you're looking at this whole idea of urban farms, roof terraces, balcony gardens, growing your own food. And that's one related aspect. But it's also, I think, at one level, how do we really look at greenery as we kind of very loosely look at it when we're looking at it as young architects and designers, and understand that every single plant or tree has its own family associations and its own birds that nest in it, or insects that build cocoons on it. So this whole idea of understanding that when we create environments, even if we are only being signed up to create environments for human beings, we have responsibilities to all the other species that also inhabit this planet. So we must always remember that when we design a space, whatever it may be, it could be an urban precinct, it could be an institution, it could be a home. But how are we being sensitive to all the other species that we're also responsible for? Um, and then the idea of continuities. So if you look at any space that you intervene in as an architect or as an interior designer, there is a history of expression that that space has had for years in many cases, because we belong to a very, very an older civilization. You're looking at 3,000 years. So whatever you add, so I'll give you an example. Like when we were working on these two homes in Kurg, uh, a lot of initial time was spent in understanding the uniqueness of that particular culture, because in Indian uh, aesthetic expression, every symbol has got many, many layers of meaning. Cultures that adopt certain patterns of expression, whether it's mandana art in Gujarat and Rajasthan, the mirror work that you see on homes, mud homes there, or you see Gond art, everything actually had a deeper history and a deeper meaning. And it was a way of actually preserving continuity in a culture. So we do need to be very conscious of how we are receiving this information and how much insight we really have into what is it that we're seeing beyond just the visual, so that whatever you create, that is going to be the next layer that is being added to that continuous narrative, is actually very deeply thought through. It's not something which is just a superficial decision. We have to think deeply about what we add into contexts. And this is an example of, on the left, actually a restoration project in Dharmaj in Gujarat. And on the right is the project I was referring to in Kurg in Karnataka earlier as well. And then the idea of, again, looking at this idea of creating place as something which is multidisciplinary, where we don't limit ourselves to separating all the different uh, disciplines of architecture, interiors, landscape, furniture, furnishings, lighting design into all these little rooms with walls between them, because it is possible as a designer or as a creative person to actually inhabit all those spaces simultaneously. so that when you create, you're actually creating a whole. So the images that I'm sharing here on this slide are actually examples of a home where everything was actually designed in collaboration with the family. From the architecture, the interiors, the furnishings, the blinds, the soft furnishings, the landscape. It was really a whole project. And it does have a certain kind of, I would say, continuity that is actually quite powerful, and a wholeness actually that's quite powerful. And also the idea of, as students starting out on your kind of journeys in design, to look at not having boundaries even in terms of what you express, whether you work on art installations like this one that I was part of, or whether it's rug collaborations, or whether it's material collaborations and material innovations. You should always be looking at growing out from your comfort zone, what you're comfortable doing. So we're always taught that we work with the architectural materials, which again, in many cases, in the kind of context of modern architecture, is limited to brick and steel and concrete. Now, that is not necessarily the case. I mean, I'll show an example further down where this is a kind of, again, an experimental project that one was working on, uh, again in the context of Gurgaon, with iamgurgaon, for a kind of a recycling station for the city, where we actually developed a structural design and a structure which was entirely in bamboo and very little steel, like literally wires, steel wires, and very little cement. And it's a beautiful structure which actually serves the purpose. And so we must always remember to also look at what we really need to employ when we're creating uh, spaces. And then the idea of actually staying hungry and staying foolish. And I think I can't emphasize this enough. I think that what is critical to constantly learning and constantly having a, what I would call, a student mindset, is that you you must always remember that there is so much more to be learned, and there's so much more to understand about the world. And always with that kind of consciousness, you will always be extremely finely tuned to what needs to be done within the specific context that you're engaging in. And then a sense of humor and perspective. This is an example of actually an origami workshop we had done as a studio with a origami artist called Ankon Mitra, and which later translated into a designing in Delhi. So this kind of cross pollination that happens when you kind of allow yourself to inhabit spaces that may not be your primary comfort zone, but which allow you to actually learn, and which allow you to create expressions which come from other sources, than the conventional sources. And the idea of innovation. I think that the idea of constantly pushing the boundaries of what is possible, of relentless personal transformation, of material innovations in terms of looking closely at what are the resources available in that local context. How can you transform those along with the skills that are also always available in any context that you work in? And how can you create something that is new and that is of today, but somehow that harnesses all these possibilities, and ideally in a way that has not been kind of thought of before? Because if you are not restoring, and if you're creating anew, then you have that responsibility to at least create something which has that value, which is reinterpreting the past, which is creating something which pulses with the dynamism of originality and innovation. Otherwise, it's really a waste of resources, right? I mean, you want to be able to do that. So here's the example of that I was actually sharing earlier, of this recycling station. And it doesn't have an image of that bamboo pavilion actually, but this is another example of the information walls that were created actually for signage, which were to educate visitors about waste and the consequences of uh, of waste, of not upcycling waste, to kind of promote more ecological behavior. And we actually did this entirely out of upcycled material, bamboo, upcycled tree guards, which were filled with cement waste and waste AC insulation material, and also locally available mud, which was used to create these bamboo and mud walls, which were almost like chatais, on which we actually mounted the signage, which was upcycled crate wood, yeah, which we printed, a flatbed printed digitally. So here again, you look at how you can harness contemporary technology and traditional ways of building. Uh, just give me 1 second. Get some water, please. To create something which is very much of today, but which also, in its own way, is actually creating something really new and radical and exciting for people to see. Uh, and this idea of instinct, trusting your instincts. So this particular project is a home that was designed by us in Chhatarpur, which is a old agricultural area converted into large farmhouses, as they're called in Delhi. And the whole idea for this project kind of grew out of the idea of what it feels like to stand under the canopy of a tree. Because, like most sites that one finds in this particular context in Delhi, it's completely bare land, right? So the fringe is kind of full of trees, but this particular site didn't even have a single tree on the site. And I remember coming to that site and actually thinking to myself that, it's amazing what we do to actually the earth, like it's completely stripped of any ecological value. And then we come in and we build these homes within them and add trees. And I think this was really a response to that, the idea of what it feels like. And as a consequence, the entire interior space is animated by these patterns of this metal cut roof, which through the year and through the day keep changing based on the sun angle. So I find that increasingly very interesting idea. How do you actually partner with the sun, when you're creating interior spaces? How do you actually create that um, kind of unexpected, of how uh, patterns are going to enter into the space and continue to change throughout the day, so that at every point in the day you're going to see another part of your room lit up based on what the sun angle is. And I think you see this more acutely in winter when the kind of sun angle dips towards the south. But what one of the learnings that I kind of derived from this project is that it is actually the south and the east and the west light which is the sharpest light. So how you employ how that light enters your spaces is actually very powerful. North light tends to be much flatter, but these other three orientations are extremely sharp. So how that light enters and animates the space becomes extremely important. And finally, I think this idea of, this is a more philosophical idea, that working from the heart, I think too often what we find, and I think what you all will find when you encounter professional practice and the, kind of real world out there, is that too much of the work that is done within the architecture and the interior design space is actually quite transactional, and I think that as a practice, we have always believed that there is a lot of our emotion and passion that goes into the spaces that we create. And I think that creates a certain energy within the space, which is very palpable and which is something that is mentioned to us time and time again. And this is something I feel that as architects and interior designers, you should not shy away from. The idea of being a professional is not that you should not feel anything and you kind of just operate out of basic professional services that you have to provide. Because architecture and interiors, especially in the context of homes, can also be a deeply collaborative and energizing space, where um, the more open you are to it and the more that you include your heart in the process, the more quality that you're creating for everybody involved. And that's something that I think that is worth remembering. And these are some beliefs that we have, which is again related to how to actually look at creating places which have greater meaning is that people are at the heart of architecture. So we must never forget that all the teams that actually go into building the space and creating spaces must be equal partners. And we must always have the humility as architects to realize that in many ways, they are the ones with the real skills, right? We have the ideas. But if we are open to learning from them, there is incredible detailing and incredible design that can emerge from it. And I'll share some of that in the later images in the practice section, where I'll share my learning of working with local craftspeople. And the idea, as I said earlier, of emotion and empathy. So I think feeling deeply for the place, feeling deeply for the people that you're creating for, you know, this creates a certain, I think, amplified quality, because, I mean, there is a very deep connect between your understanding of a family's needs and what they value and what they give meaning to, and what you therefore choose to include in the spaces that you create for them. So that is important as well. And this, the idea of harnessing local skills, of dreaming local, this is, I feel, critical in whatever context that you work in, because we are very fortunate in India to actually inhabit a space where there is still a great tradition of making, small makers, small workshops, and a huge, I would say, heritage really of people making with their hands with a high degree of skill and a very high degree of aesthetic sensitivity as well. And we really, I mean, if we don't actually harness this, it's a huge loss to ourselves, to that context. So we do have a responsibility to try and ensure that we allow this to continue into the future narrative. And these are three very different homes, one in Coorg, one in Kumaon, and one in Delhi, all of which have very different expression, but all of which have completely harnessed local skills in the choice of materials and the choice of expression. Again, coming back to collaboration. So one of the things that I think that we also need to be conscious of is, how do you create this shared world? Many times when you're, especially in the context of homes, when you're creating interior spaces for families, um, you have many individuals within that space, often with conflicting requirements and needs and likes and dislikes. So even to find the language, the right narrative that will actually support and, what I would say, fulfill the needs of the entire family, that too is a fine art that we have to actually really listen very carefully, and watch very carefully in order to build that skill. And then the idea of crafting of space that goes beyond the more conventional understanding of craft. Many times when we're looking at the idea of craft within space or interior spaces, we're only looking at it as a kind of, almost like it's like, it's a technique that is actually just being applied within the interior. But beyond that, there's also the idea of actually crafting a space. How do you actually put together materials, diverse materials, whether it's and color and material, and how do you create that uniqueness? I mean, this particular set of images collage is a home that was done for a young lawyer client in a DTA apartment, which is actually government built apartments here in Delhi, in a place called Mandakini. And if you look at all the images, they're all extremely different in their colors and in their, kind of materiality, but they all connect to a common, young, quirky, and rather unique aesthetic and almost graphic use of color. And this was something that we learned from the client. I mean, this was something that she really enjoyed. And actually, by creating this space with her, we learned so much in terms of how powerful black or gray can be actually within an interior, in terms of offsetting other materials. So many other such, many other learnings. But largely, I think that this becomes the most exciting part of collaborating with people. That you will find that you will learn something different from each context that you work in, provided you're open and you're willing to listen. And the last two beliefs are the importance of the hand. So here again, this comes back to really traditional skills and working with a hand. And it's also exciting because today we live in a world where you can actually kind of put together this traditional skills and the importance of the hand along with far the latest technology, whether it's laser cutting, whether it's water jet cutting, and which is all really robotic, which is actually not being done by hand. But how do you really look at opportunities where perhaps you can combine the two? So for example, you have a hand drawn a pattern which is then rendered by uh, laser jet. So in that way, you have actually managed to, and maybe it's a pattern, a historic pattern, which is a reference from uh, that particular context, and how you bring it into the present and make it kind of relevant for the future is really when I think a lot of exciting things begin to happen. And lastly, the idea of architecture being a change agent. So I think while we talk about place and space and uniqueness, we also need to remember that we always have the potential for architecture to transform the context within which it's placed. So anything that you create as an architect, whether when you build in the hills, for example, when we chose to build in the hills in Kumaon with local stone and traditional wooden roofing and materiality that existed there, that same expression then became adopted by many other people building in that same area. So you always have the opportunity to actually orient uh, the future building in that area based on the sensitivity with which you're creating within that space. And that's always a potential that is there, kind of inherent in every project that you undertake, and we must never forget that. um, so now I'll come to more specific imagery, which is related to the practice of architecture and interiors. And I'd like to share how we have actually done this, over the last 20 years. So, as I had briefly discussed very early on in the introduction in this presentation, that for us, the idea of an architecture of resonance is actually guided by these overarching principles of cultural specificity and ecological consciousness, which are then expressed through the values of beauty, timelessness, repose, sensory richness, and dynamic value. And the degree to which any of these values are expressed within each project. So if I were to look at it in terms of as a balance of which one is highlighted more, there may be projects where you want to actually emphasize repose more than anything else, because that is the quality of the context or the needs of the family. Or there may be certain projects or homes or spaces where the sensory richness actually becomes the most important element, or value embedded in that interior space, in the design of it. And in some, maybe it's dynamic value, because those are kind of the needs of the client that, they want something which is really experimental, really innovative, really not thought of before. And these all become opportunities to then create things that are, therefore, you know, uh, unique. So I've already been through the attitudes and beliefs, and I'll now get to the values. So at the heart of our practice is actually this idea that, thoughtfulness, sensitivity, innovation, playfulness, and passion is actually the springboard for great ideas. We also, I think, have always looked very carefully at how people inhabit and enjoy space, and that really guides our creative process. Yeah. So these are the values, and I'll start with genus loci. So this idea of dwelling. So, how does a space become a place is when a person can dwell truly in that place. So when a person can orient herself or himself, identify with the environment, and most importantly, experience it as meaningful. So it's only when an environment is actually experienced as meaningful that life actually occurs there, right? And these are spaces with distinct character. And so the intent is always for us to create meaningful places, which are unique and finely crafted and also rooted in place. So these are some images from projects we've done over the years, and I've added a timeline so you get a sense of the year in which the project was completed. And again, what you'll see recurring across many of these projects will be the same ideas that I discussed earlier, which is how does the light enter, the shade, the climatic comfort, materiality, how does the brick meet the stone. This particular example is of an upcycled, we actually took old windows and old balusters which were kind of reappropriated from a older architectural spaces, and it was put together in a contemporary way, along with another element here, which is actually laser cut metal. So combining the past and present techniques to create something which then has a dynamic value because you're really reinterpreting in a way that it hasn't been used before. And here, something which is perhaps higher on the dynamic value and the sensory richness for another client, where it was really a home that was designed as an entertainment space. And at the same time, we actually used materials like copper and wood, and again laser cut metal and stone to create an environment which and reflective mirror to create this environment which has a sense of mystery and it has a sense of drama, but it also has a very, very kind of, I would say, rooted materiality. So it's materials that copper, for example, is one of the oldest materials that have been used in India. So it's a material that I'm actually very, very, very drawn to for that reason. And then here another project which is actually extremely quiet in its expression. It's almost monochromatic. So it's just different tones of this earthy beige and gray, uh, in slate, in concrete, in grit, in slate, and yet there's a very, very unique quality and quiet to this. This was actually a second home for a family, a Gurgaon based family, and they're staying in it right now. So yeah. And then the idea of cultural specificity. So wherever you actually build, like this is the example of the home that we did in Kur, where we actually used hand cut, dressed granite columns, and we used traditional double roofing techniques where you have, a tile below and a tile above, and then a little insulation in the middle so that the spaces remain cooler, as well as traditional laterite construction, exposed laterite, so that it truly is rooted in that place and culture. And so the idea that it's, like cultural specificity is can be read at many different levels. It's not just the culture of the place, it's also the culture of the community, it's also the culture of the family. And finally coming down to the unique set of individuals within the family. And all of these people actually have both stated, perceived, and unstated needs. And as architects and interior designers, it's actually our endeavor to create this setting that is almost like a second skin. That's really what we're trying to create. It's something that effortlessly harmonizes with the context as well as the lifestyle and needs of the family, so that it kind of weaves itself into both the architectural, visual, and cultural fabric of that larger context. This was for actually a corporate office in Gurgaon, where we actually used a lot of what I like to call the colors of the Aravalis, which is our context here in Gurgaon, which is where my practice is also based, is is the golds and the grays and the browns and the deeper oranges of the landscape as it changes over the seasons. And so these are colors that we actually use across many of our projects that are based in this part of the world, because I do believe that it somehow connects to the larger landscape in a very beautiful way. This is another home which is a first floor, and there's a betak. So we have these cast concrete columns which were actually stained and cast with a mold, so that they are permanent, kind of raw and kind of unadorned, but with a base which is actually like kota stone with a little herringbone carved pattern, and then slate and local Delhi quartzite stone. So, in a way, bringing together and Jaisalmer, which is easily accessed from Rajasthan, which is a neighboring state. So, how we bring together all these materials and the palette really to, and then that's another apartment interior which is more Asia inspired, and another apartment in Gurgaon where it was a more India inspired interior, where this was actually they belonged to the Sikh faith. So this was a small cupboard that was actually made for the Granth Sahib, which is actually very, very sacred to Sardar families. And so the whole room kind of drew from that. And this is again another home in Coorg, where we actually worked very carefully with the local carpentry team. And we looked at this traditional wood turning technique for balusters and if you watch carefully the carving on this, they're very subtle elements which are all harnessing traditional carpentry techniques and skills that the team there had. And then the idea of ecological consciousness, which is really about, I think for us as a practice, always been about um, using material in a way that, or rather employing material in a way that it becomes a maintenance free finish, and being deeply conscious of the fact that even though there may be a little, I would say, slightly elevated cost at the start of the project because you're not just painting and plastering a facade, but over the life cycle of the building, there's actually zero maintenance. So, what you save in terms of material, in terms of labor, in terms of energy over the life cycle of the building is equally important, and something that you must, as architects going out into the world, always remember that it's not about the point at which you kind of complete a project, but it's also a deep sensitivity to 10 years from that day, 20 years from that day, 30 years from that day. How is that uh, design going to perform over those 30 years? You have to look at how those materials are going to perform over those 30 years. And only when you actually have looked at all those aspects can you make the right choices. So, so really looking at natural materials, looking at raw, exposed concrete. In this case, it's a vaulted roof, and we actually embedded leaves from the garden in the roof to create something that was uniquely belonging to that particular context. And in fact, the client partnered with us in this and got very excited about the whole process. So it was really one of those very, very meaningful and memorable spaces for the family. And this is another home where local cast iron techniques were employed, and we actually upcycled existing cast iron terrace and laterite and woodwork. And then another project, which is actually now in Gurgaon, where the idea was to actually celebrate more the more Indian use of color and stone and crafts and carving. And that was actually expressed through this wall right at the entrance, which kind of immediately orients you and gives you a sense of arrival. Because the impact of this one stone wall with the way that the wood carving is inserted in it is something which kind of marks a really kind of distinct point of entry. And this is another home, which is a courtyard home, which was built again at a for a client who was designing a home that kind of reminded her of southern homes built in southern India. And so a lot of the materiality and the kind of expression that we have used here alludes to that, but in a kind of uh, more contemporary way. Here's another home in Gurgaon where we actually upcycled old stone niches and used a lot of gravel and stone in the landscape so that you actually have more porous surfaces as well in the ground. And the idea of sensory richness. So in this home, we actually looked at very simple materials. It was actually like, I mean, rough Dholpur stone, exposed roofs, uh, simple uh, timber and board ceilings. And yet, by planning lighting very carefully, very, very simple materials become really magical because when light kind of falls on them, there is a completely different quality to the interior when you see it in the day and when you see it at the night. So this is also something that we must be conscious of and which we are not always that sensitive to when we're designing and selecting materials for a project, is that how is the light, how do you really use light in a kind of transformative way within the space. And this can actually really transform a space and the experience of that space. Because when you visit that space in the day and when you visit that space in the evening, you're going to see two completely different things, you know. And here we have again the idea of sensory richness, materiality of copper, of inlaid wood, of steel, of wallpaper. And all these materials kind of come together to create a kind of India inspired contemporary interior, which still manages to have a certain degree of quietness and simplicity. And this is the same home, another section of the same home, which is actually a bar and a small home theater space, where we again actually just used a combination of different materials kind of in an unexpected way to create a kind of, and again, light, which is something that I'll keep returning to because I think that place is and light are really kind of critically related to each other. So you need to, light can either amplify a space and transform a space, or it can just make a space completely flat. So you do need to be very, very conscious of that when you're designing a home or an interior. Again, a dining area with a backlit corner, lamps, and chandeliers, which are all, if you notice, and a cove light, which are all kind of placed in very specifically chosen places to balance each other out and to create pools of light. You know, so you're not creating even lighting through the space, but you're creating these little pools of drama, which somehow, therefore, become a very unique story. Another home, also in Gurgaon, where again you can see how color and lighting and materiality have come together, and also interestingly how complementary, and we learn about the color wheel, but there are colors that always reach out for each other. So like blue and orange, there are many other colors which are opposite each other actually on the color wheel spectrum, but which work very well together within interior spaces because you have also receding color and you also have color that kind of uh, comes forward, and your understanding of how much of each to kind of select to put into an interior space in order to find that balance is really, really important. And this is another office interior that we've done in Gurgaon, which is again here. This was a actually a cafe kind of breakout recreational area, and we used wicker and cane and orange leatherite actually because it was a high usage area and they were concerned about maintenance. But somehow, even in a cafe, which is actually for a corporate office, there's a certain warmth in the space, which is through the colors and the materials that have been chosen, that takes away from our conventional experience of a cafe as a very kind of, I would say, utilitarian space, cold, easy to maintain, but not therefore not really allowing you to dwell within that space. So you can see here how color and materiality make such a difference in terms of allowing that to happen. And again, textures, how this particular wall is made of upcycled create wood squares, which have been actually cut and actually made into a composition of squares and lit with a cocoon light. This is by Indie Store. And how just very simple materiality, but this is a space which you can never forget. It's something which has a unique quality because of the juxtaposition of the square and the circle and how the materials and light come together. And then the idea of timelessness. So, I mean, this is a very interesting kind of what I would call the contradiction, the inherent contradiction in creating spaces that have dynamic value and that have the sensory richness, but also have enough of timelessness that uh, that spaces continue to resonate with meaning and quality and aesthetic value for families that kind of inhabit those spaces. And people don't tire of those spaces quickly, especially in the context of architecture. Because when you're building a home, I mean, an architectural space, you're building for about 20 years, at least 20, 30 years. And you do want to employ materials and an aesthetic quality that can somehow endure, and therefore also nurture and restore that family or the inhabitants, based on what the typology is, for a longer period of time. These are examples again of various projects where light, material, forms come together to create timeless spaces. And then repose. So I think increasingly in the kind of, I would say that we live in a world where we're really all constantly being bombarded by images, and we're almost like in a state of overstimulation always. So I think increasingly it's become important to kind of, it's almost, I think, a requirement in my mind of spaces that actually allow a pause, that allow a stillness, that allow silence, that allow blank spaces. I mean, we don't need to actually fill everything, or uh, there must be always ideas, especially when you look at homes, of what can be added later. You don't need to add everything on day one, and complete the place or space or home, so that as the family grows, as the family travels, as the family changes, there are those opportunities for addition, and for incremental change, which allow that to happen. So, again, this comes back to the idea of the art of seeing that I spoke about in the initial slides. That how do you know when to stop? How do you know when you have reached the point of balance? When you don't need to do more, you know? That's a very, very important skill to learn. And the point of balance will always be very different from context to context and family to family, based on exactly what is required for that particular context. And then beauty. Now, this is usually the focal point of most architecture and interior design spaces today, where this is what people are only concerned with. And increasingly, I think one of the thoughts that, I'm beginning to have is that, and I think somebody said this very interestingly in the context one of these seminars, which is that why do we always assume that architecture needs to be beautiful? Sometimes it may not need to be beautiful, because art doesn't need to be, and somehow architecture is always trapped in that little prison of it must always be beautiful. Maybe not, maybe it can get people to be a little uncomfortable, sometimes, and that may be a good thing, so yeah. So the idea of, how beauty lies in the relationship between line and form, how colors mix in space almost impressionistically, how light softens or amplifies textures and the reflectivity of materials, and really the poetics of space. And finally, dynamic value. So this is actually the hardest to kind of explain, and I think there's this amazing book called Leela, An Inquiry into Morals by Robert Pirsig, which you should all try and read. And it talks about how you cannot define this. It is pre-intellectual and it's a cutting edge of reality because you can recognize it before you can conceptualize it. So you know that something is actually something new that you're witnessing because you can feel it, right? And you can, before you can kind of intellectualize it, you've always already experienced it through your body, through your eyes, through your senses. So that's what it basically means. But the idea of being sensitive to that, so that whenever you create something, it actually holds this dynamic value. So it kind of creates, in its own subtle way, a slightly new reality, a slight shift from the past. So this can only be experienced and felt, and it kind of dwells in reinterpretation, freshness, playfulness, imagination, luminosity, innovation, and it basically initiates new trajectories of possibility. These are again some pictures of projects over the years. And I'd like to end with a small section on uh, possible futures. So if we look at uh, kind of to sum up what we've spoken about today, and then I've left about a half an hour for questions and any comments that you may have, so that we can discuss that. Is where are we headed beyond this idea of design as space and as experience of place? Um, where do we need to be headed, or what do we need to be starting to think about when we're looking at how this is going to happen, how we're going to be doing all of this? So increasingly there's this idea of human centric design, which has become extremely kind of like a buzzword, and something which is emerging across all design disciplines as the idea of really intuitive design, which you're beginning to see across devices, across spaces. And I think this idea that the person, the experience actually guides the design. So you're actually thinking about the design purely from the standpoint of experience. And it's very interesting that a lot of the time, a lot of modern architecture especially tends to be very external form driven. I mean, it's very much the box and the circle and the line and then fitting everything into it. And interestingly, this is something that as a practice we have done from day one. For us, our homes actually grow from the inside out, not the outside in. So actually, the experience of the home is actually the starting point of how the forms emerge. And it's really that experiential quality, how you move from one space to the other space, and what do you see, where do your views open, where do you look into green spaces, where do you see blank walls. All of that actually guides how designs are created. And I think increasingly this is going to become more and more experience guided, whether you see technology coming in now through motion sensors, through voice activated lights. And I think there is going to be this whole journey towards customizing spaces so uniquely for individuals that sometimes the question emerges as to that if somebody else enters the space, will they be able to even use it effectively? So that's an interesting question. And then this idea of design resilience. So I think that we are now at a point in time when we can no longer, even conceive of anything as only a singular function. Because we are coming to a point, I think, in our planet's history where um, our resources are simply not there anymore. So we really have to think through about uh, how much multifunctional utility or usage can each space have, and inherently start examining everything that we do from that perspective. So, as architects, we're always trained to think of solutions that involve building. But many times, you don't have to build to actually create something exceptional. You can create a program. You can create a program, for example, just to give you a small example, like if we were to look at the idea of, community centers, rural community centers, and or rural craft spaces. And many times, I think in many kind of design competitions or student competitions where I've been a juror, this emerges from time to time, because we're always trying to create a space that is not part of the village, as a space that people go to as a craft center or as a visitor center. But many times now you have an opportunity of getting people to come into the space and maybe inhabit extra rooms in a village, and that becomes a different way of creating a more authentic experience that actually gives back to community and also upgrades existing infrastructure. So we have to really flip our thinking in a way that we're really looking at how can we create spaces and experiences that actually benefit the largest number of people, and don't always uh, follow the predictable path of just consuming more resources. And then the idea of participatory design, how I think another thing that one is going to have to think about and try and integrate into design is going to be the idea of allowing people to partner in controlling the environment, yeah, of what is being created, what views are you seeing, whether you have sliding screens, whether you have uh, ways by which spaces can change from day to night or through the day for different activities. These are all things that we need to start thinking about. And then designing with nature, which is something which has been there for a very long time, including biomimicry, but which is slowly, I think, changing. And coming to the last point that I've listed here, this idea of integrating artificial intelligence and biological processes. There's an extremely bright researcher and practitioner called Neri Oxman, who runs the Mediated Matter Lab, which you should look up. And she's doing some crazy work which looks at actually combining the technical aspects of robotics and making through programming, and then collaborating with biological organisms like silkworms to actually weave the surfaces of those structures. So it's very interesting to kind of like the edges of what you can create, which kind of really is radical in that sense. And I think that's something we must also always be conscious of. And then finally, this idea of design as healing. I think increasingly we all need to focus on that as something that is critical for environments, for contexts, for it's something that is critically required in the environment today. And how we think about it in many ways has to go beyond just the superficial aesthetic perception of a space. Whether you look at geomancy as a field of looking at geopathic lines, you look at vastu as another science which also aligned energies, or you look at highly technical aspects of interior design spaces, which is air purification, and how do you create environments that maximize environmental air quality, water based pu, not using elements, water based paint, so you're not using materials that are going to continue to leach chemicals into the air. So there are many things that you need to think about and that are going to become increasingly critical in the future. And so this is my last slide, and I'm going to leave you here with these thoughts. And can we now open to questions and discussion?
Thank you so much, ma'am, for an intense presentation. Yes, now the forum is open for questions. Students, do you have any questions? Faculty members?
Fennon, can we just minimize this? How do we minimize this? I think escape, right? Yeah. Just one
Well,
second.
you can just stop your presentation.
Yeah, I'm just doing that. This is closed, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Nobody has any questions.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Hello, I am Harsh Sharma. I work as assistant professor at APIED.
Yeah.
So, obviously, as Pratyusha ma'am said, it was a great presentation. What
Thank you.
I'm like intending to ask is that in all of your projects, there was a large scopes to get that one-to-one intuitive response from your users. But when it is about mass housing or social housing, the way we see it's been executed right now by government, maybe it's LIG, MIG, how do you think the designers can still have the passive role if not active because there are so many users? So where do you think a designer should very cautiously withdraw from the designing process? Not withdraw actually, but become a more of a passive designer instead of an active designer, and not to over specify things so that it like it suits to the larger public group.
So that's a very good question, and I think extremely relevant to our country today because it's really, I think, mass housing is something which is it's going to be a need in India for years to come, and it's really an ignored segment to a large extent if you look at cities across India today. So what I would say to you is that sensitivity uh, can allow you to bridge that gap where you do not understand what specific family is going to inhabit the home. Now, I'll give you a very small example. We are always being taught and asked to design for even these categories of LIG, MIG. So that's in itself already a kind of problem, right? Because
Right,
there are
right.
many very narrow definitions which actually
True,
don't
true.
really match up. It's so when you look at even if you look at let's say high-end community apartment buildings in Gurgaon, right? There is only that four-bedroom, five-bedroom penthouse model available, right?
True, true.
And this is where that sensitivity has to cross across economic categories. Where if you're designing a one-bedroom, we did a actually worker housing project for a company called Triveni in UP in a small little and not even a town actually called Sabitkar and Chandanpur. And our lesson there was, and a lot of the lessons that you get is by looking at secondary case studies. Because when you have really small footprints of homes, what you really need to pay attention to is community spaces and
Exactly.
terraces,
Right.
okay, spillover spaces, which allow, and I think, this very, very, everyone's heard of Alejandro Arevana, who won the Pritzker Prize. And one of his famous projects was actually homes which had they were half a house. They were designed as half a house so that poorer families could afford the house because there was less built up on day one. And then people could add in their own way, as their needs changed. So, whether now that's such a simple device, but it
Right.
allows such a great degree of interpretation. Suppose somebody wants to add a shop because they, or an office because they're running a small home. So eventually, I think that, understanding extremely sensitively attuned frameworks to diversity and choices is what will make sure that you can always allow people to collaborate with what you've created, even if you don't know who is going to inhabit the space. So, but you have to create a program that is going to be rich enough and I would say varied enough that it allows every kind of family to find its own home there. It's not like a standard, so whether it's a one bedroom home with a small balcony, or a one bedroom home with a large terrace, or a one bedroom home with a rooftop, so how do you actually, in the design of the form, and then not get into this, as they say, cookie cutter, one over the other, over the other, over the other, where there's a sameness which can't possibly meet everybody's needs. You know
Right.
what I mean? So it's always possible. And I think that if you just look carefully in that specific geographical context on how people are built in the past, okay, and how people in the present in other contexts are inhabiting similar spaces, you will get all the cues you need to figure out what needs to be done. but you have to have the rigor and you have to have the, I would say, the eye to see those things, So that's what you really need to develop, is that uh, the concentration to look so carefully at something that you can understand exactly what needs to be extracted from that, the information, you know. And it all happens. It's all possible. I'm very optimistic. I don't believe that. And I do believe that things are changing now where lots of possibilities are emerging which may not have existed earlier. I think city administrations are becoming more people centric, more open to ideas. I've had some great experiences in Gurgaon working with the administration. So there is a great field of potential that is opening out and that has opened out. And we just need to be ready to run with it, to be able to imagine enough to create something which nobody's thought of. And I think that to me is really probably our primary role, is envisaging envisaging something which nobody else can see, you know, that has the potential to transform things. That's really what we need to be looking at. I hope I answered your question.
Very well, ma'am. Very well, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Harsh.
Any other question from student side?
Any other
Hello, ma'am.
questions? Yeah, hi, who's this?
Uh, Hi, ma'am. It's Shivam here.
Hi, Shivam.
Uh, Ma'am, first of all, I love the presentation, and I would like to thanks all the faculties to arrange such events. And yeah, I just like the kind of ideas you just presented. It was I got uh, what to say. The first one which I got much inspired by was that of the New Delhi, that the people living there were having that barren land, and the shade they provided to give them the impact of living under a shed. So I have two questions mainly, that how at this level, being in a college, how we get to know, get like explore the ideas uh, like this. And also the second question is, since we are in college, it's the evolving stage, and when we get to um, the live ground, that is after the graduation, then how are we supposed to uh, just move from the naive, and like when we are in the college years, we get to like just evolve, like the faculties used to share things, and we used to get more awareness and knowledge about things. Like this event, I got so much things to know about. So uh, I'm little bit confused that how we jump from the college and get to the live ground, like being an architect. So what how to fill that gap?
So it's a very good question, and I don't think you need to worry, Shivam. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to say that you have to be very patient. Okay, this is one thing which I really say to especially your generation, because you've grown up at a time in history when you have so many facts and information and influences and I would say motivations that are constantly working on you, that even an ability to kind of step back a little and kind of root yourself in yourself, is extremely important. So, one of the first things that I would tell you is before you do anything, right? These years in college are actually a time for you to actually understand yourself. Okay, figure out who you really are, what are your values within the larger threshold of architectural values. What I shared with you are the values that our practice has embodied over the years. And this has been a slowly learned and developed thing, over the years. I only actually did this, I think I did this I derived this, I realized that this is what we stood for maybe about 8 years ago. That was after 12 years of practice. So, what I would say to you is that first start to narrow down what is seeming to be your fields of interest. Most importantly, I think the most important thing in architecture is it's not an easy practice. It's not a easy career. Okay, it is hugely demanding. It is stretches you in many directions beyond design, which you will realize. Also, if you're like an entrepreneur like me and you run your own practice, you need psychology, you need management, you need financial expertise, you need many other things beyond a highly refined aesthetic sensibility, which you will learn through experience. As a student, as you kind of emerge into the world, and as a practitioner, I would suggest work with sensitive and work with uh, what I would call serious practices, for the first at least 3-4 years of your life. Don't be in a hurry to move. Spend time, immerse yourself, understand, see through full projects. You will learn a lot through spending time in a place which, in my opinion, should resonate with the values that you believe in, which does the kind of work that you would like to do. So you're there as an apprentice to kind of learn how this is done, exactly what you asked. How it is done can be learned from the right mentors. So choose your mentors very carefully, where you work for the first 3-4 years of your practice. And then, if you feel the need, further studies. If you want to study further and you want to now refine your thinking through whatever you've learned, that is a great option as well, but only for people who are really interested in that particular journey. Um, and the rest will unfold as it goes along. So don't worry too much about it. So that would be my advice.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you so much.
I hope I answered your question.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other question? Okay. So now I would like to request Professor Sanjay Pitroda to propose a vote of thanks to architect Swanzal Kak Kapoor. Sanjay sir.
Yeah, Swanzal. Hi.
Hi,
I hope
hi.
you can see me.
I can't see you just now.
Good to see you.
I can't see
You can't hear me?
No. I can hear you. I can't
You
see
can't
you.
see me?
No.
I think my camera is on. Yep. Hello. Can you see me right now?
Okay. It's showing me actually only. Yeah, I can see your screen. I can see but I can't see your face. Is your video off?
Yeah, my on off बंद करें चालू करो. Yes, it's on.
Okay, I
No,
can't
it's
see
not
you
this
still,
folder.
but just why don't you carry on? Yeah.
Yeah, I could just a minute. Yeah, yes. Today only Harsh sir reminded your presentation is there. Then I proudly told him, yes, Swanzal is our classmate. I was really excited to hear you. Really.
Yeah, of
Yeah,
course.
I think you can see now.
No, I can't see you still. It's very strange.
Okay.
I don't know why it's not.
Yeah. How come my camera is on and all this stuff? I think मैं इधर आता हूँ. मैं दूसरे उसमें आता हूँ. Just wait.
I could see the other students when they were speaking, but I can't see you. I don't know why. It's strange. Yeah, I can see Harsh now.
I'm just asking Sanjay sir to use my computer.
Okay.
Yes, sir, you can come back. Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, now.
Yes, of course I see you.
Good.
Good to see you,
Yes.
Sanjay.
So, wow, again, I really enjoyed the presentation. Good to see you again. And I'm speechless. What shall I say? Yeah, really. See, even I would really would like to tell the students, you must have seen your presentation, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, but you won't believe I really enjoyed the fourth and fifth dimension in architecture, which is the time and the philosophy. And so there are many dimensions to it. They should learn how the playfulness of light in your architecture, which changes, which breaks the monotony, the climate, and the vernacular architecture, which connects the client to the modern architecture also. So it was very dynamic. See, they should learn these things. जैसे I think शिवम ने भी पूछा था कि मैडम ये मैजिक कहाँ से आएगा? Of course, one should have a patience and the level of maturity by using the senses is very, very important thing. They should not carried away by the modern market and or something. Of course, I would like to share one like अपने college के time पर it's very like मेरा sharing है. When used to Harsh sir, जब हमारा एक होता था ना अपने क्या thesis नहीं presentation jury. Everybody, we were in the fair competition. Everybody was counting कितनी sheets हुई ये वो. All quantity wise देख रहे थे. But the minute we waited for the Swanzal's presentation, the magic started. The way she spoke, every juror was speechless. Nobody would dare to even stop her or argue her. Really, really, seriously. So that is what the architect should learn. The way one should present the design. It's not about the design is the byproduct, of course. Nowadays, boxes and all this happens. It is about the vocabulary, the language, and the way you speak. They should learn this. I really appreciate. I really, truly appreciate. Thanks for.
Thank you. Thank
Yeah,
you so much, Sanjay.
thank
And
you. Yeah. I was back to the future. कि अरे, I was in the old golden days.
you're so
Seriously, seriously.
bad. I tell you, you're so
seriously.
bad. No, but I want to just say one thing that,
Yeah,
and this is very true what you just said, Sanjay, which is
yeah,
that,
yeah.
when you speak with conviction,
Yes,
that's the important thing. Conviction. And
definitely.
conviction is a belief in what you are doing, and what you are creating. That conviction will come through your voice only
Exactly.
when it is there, when it is mind, heart, hand, when
Exactly.
it doesn't stop at the mind and it doesn't stop at the heart or at the heart or at the hand. It
Yeah.
has to be all three. And
Mm,
only when you actually are that fully immersed in what you're doing is it
exactly.
going to naturally emanate from you. So it's
Def-
not something that you kind of produce. It's not an act. It's not a facade. It is inherent and it's
Definitely.
authentic. And the reason that people listen, as Sanjay said, is that this quality something I've had since I was, as young as I can remember,
Exactly.
because that's my nature. I get into everything very deeply. I care very deeply about what I do. And that, I think, is the second thing I want to say is that please feel deeply for what you do. Otherwise, don't do it. Find something else you want to do, whether you want to start a bakery or do something you're passionate about. Only practice architecture if you cannot imagine yourself doing anything else, because otherwise you will create something which is not really reached its full potential. And uh, being able to communicate that, being able to communicate that feeling and that passion for what you can see emerging is mostly what all your clients are going to listen to. Most of them don't understand drawings. They
Yeah.
are only reacting to the energy they feel from you. When they feel this energy, they get excited about the project. So
Very true.
they
Very true.
understand that what you're going to create is going to be so special. So it's actually a very, very important life skill as an architect, but it's also something which must be, in my opinion, integral to your personality and to how you are practicing architecture, because people will figure it out. You can say the right words, but if you're not feeling it, they will know that you're just putting up a facade. So it
Exactly.
has to be authentic. So, but thanks for that reminder.
Seriously, seriously. Yeah, yeah. Definitely, definitely.
So
And
you Your
Yeah,
team.
of course. I was told to say vote of thanks to you from APIED Family School of Architecture. I would say ID की तरफ से APIED तो बाद में आया है. I would like to thanks you again कि आपने इतना valuable time निकाल के you have not only inspired student, personally you have inspired me again. You have reminded my old days because we're trying to figure out how magical we can be like this thing. We can because होता क्या है कि जूरी के दिन एक तो हम पूरी रात जगे होते हैं, हवा निकली हुई होती है, we are stressed out physically, and to speak so much from heart is very challenging. Definitely. And even I would like to say vote of thanks to my team also, her sir, Mira madam, and IT family, and सब सारे faculties को, कंदर sir को, कि उन्होंने ये chance दिया कि आप हमारे यहाँ आए. Seriously,
No,
both
no.
sides, seriously.
It
We
was a
should have
complete pleasure, and
definitely,
I think as
definitely.
I think Harsh said earlier that
Yeah,
these opportunities for students to interact and connect with a diverse set of mentors is something you should very actively continue to pursue, because this is the one time when it has become so easy for this to
yeah,
happen.
yeah.
In fact, the whole old model of teachers coming into classrooms, I think, is gone forever, in many
Seriously,
ways.
yeah.
Gone
That thing is
forever.
missing.
We
Yeah,
have to respond to this new normal and look at the incredible potential within it.
definitely.
Today, you can reach out to a Norman Foster's office or to Anjalendran or to
Mm, mm,
anybody and say, we only want 1 hour of your time. I doubt that any practitioner who has their heart in the right place will say no to students, because
yeah,
students are the future. If we don't invest in kind of sharing our learning with students, what is going to happen? I think most of us feel the responsibility to do that. So it's
exactly.
really an opportunity to make kind of connections that you wouldn't have even thought about earlier, because you were so busy with the faculty coming in and going, and वही जो standard चल रहा था. So there's great potential here, and I'm sure all of you will tap it.
Definitely.
And my
Surely,
pleasure.
surely.
I really